So welcome to our fourth edition of Because We've Read. We are a radical international book club here to challenge the way that we all think about the world and ourselves and our place within it. We are going to be discussing Edward Said today with the amazing Hatem Bazian. And this is the last reading that we've done on a unit of decolonization. So we started with Assata Shakur's autobiography, then we went to Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. We read Omar Barghouti's Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions as an emergency reading, and we're ending with Edward Said, who is my intellectual crush and one of my favorite authors. And we're going to be sort of introing the book, and even if you haven't read it, we'll still be discussing themes that he's been talking about, as well as his implications and how the book relates to us today and the work that we're doing around the world. Also, just a heads up that Instagram Live does cut out at the 45-minute mark, so that will be finished right then, and then we'll restart. So if you'd like to just hold off, we'll quickly restart the Instagram Live, and you can join. We also, next month is actually going to be our first break month. So that being said, we're not actually going to be assigning new readings. We're going to let people catch up on everything that we've read, but also engage with our local chapters to do work in the communities around the issues that we've talked about. So anything from increasing literacy and bringing radical books to local schools or community centers, to also working on projects that focus on decolonization, internalized Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, and things like this in our communities. So make sure you check out our local chapters. We have almost 30 around the world. We have a little highlight on our Instagram page where you can find all of them. Also, feel free to ask questions or comments at any time. If they're directly related to a question that we're talking about at the time, I can go ahead and ask it. If it's unrelated, please feel free to still ask. I can go back, and then at the end, we'll save time for Q&A and comments. So no need to ask a million times. I'll try my best to scroll up. And so that being said, I'm really excited and elated and pleased to introduce Dr. Hatem Bazian, an unapologetic decolonial Islamic thinker. He is the founder of everything: American Muslims for Palestine, Zaytuna College. He's a professor at Berkeley. There he also studied the Islamophobia Studies Journal, the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project. And his most recent articles include pieces on double standards in FIFA, the Palestinian liberation theory, Muslim exclusion in the United States. So really prolific writer, amazing thinker. And his Twitter handle is at Hatem Bazian. That's HATEM BAZIAN. And we can tweet him. We're also live tweeting the conversation right now. So that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce who Zionists and the alt-right called the most dangerous professor in America, Dr. Hatem Bazian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and thanks for all the listeners from across the world. And hopefully, we'll have a decolonial discussion.
Inshallah. So I just wanted to start. If you could please give us just a quick background on Edward Said. Who was he? Why is his writing important today? And so why are we reading these texts?
Well, Edward Said is a Palestinian who experienced exile. His family is exiled from Jerusalem, from Palestine, making it to Egypt, then Lebanon, then finally coming to the United States to study. And in a sense, his experience as a Palestinian refugee displaced as a result of settler colonialism in terms of the creation of Israel, displacement of Palestinians, got him to really engage in writing. Initially, his specialty is linguistics and comparative literature, but then later on began to engage in writing about the Palestinians, the question of Palestine, Orientalism, cultural imperialism, and a whole other host of work that focused on, I would say, the double standard, the erasures that Palestinians have faced, and that got him into really beginning to write in a different trajectory altogether. His work on both Orientalism, on covering Islam, and then the question of Palestine, he thinks of them as a trilogy that they need to be read together or in conversation with each other. And I would also add his work on the role of the intellectual and cultural in imperialism. I think that genre of work collectively is very important for anyone that wants to engage with the subject of Islam, the Muslim world. I don't like to use the term Middle East because that itself is a colonially constructed term and a colonially constructed geography. And part of decolonization is to undo and to do deprogramming before we actually engage in programming or understanding the terms and the ideas that we use. So I think his work is very critical. His answer to the Clash of Civilization thesis that has become dominant at the present period is also an important reading. It's a very long essay that he wrote for The Nation, which was his response to both Bernard Lewis, the doyen of Orientalism, and then Huntington, who made the thesis very widely popular and widely read, both in his Foreign Affairs article and then later on in the book. His response to it, I think, is still very timely and a must-read because many of those who advocate or at least problematize the Muslim subject with the Clash of Civilization thesis are still beholden to that worldview. And his response to label it as a clash of ignorance is precisely what it is, and I think that has to be read as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And would you mind, because some people might not finish the book, so would you mind just walking us through what are the major themes of Edward Said's book, both in Orientalism and covering Islam? If you want to just start going through and also kind of describe each one. So what is the significance of each theme that he's touching on?
Well, I think if you want to encapsulate Orientalism in terms of as an overall theme, Edward Said is critiquing knowledge production and the whole structure of representation in relations to what is called the Orient. And again, that term, the Orient, is a figment of Eurocentric imagination, assuming that their imagination still exists, but that's a side point. So, in essence, he points to the whole structure of representation that on the back of this representation becomes a whole process of how to need to dominate, to transform, to civilize those societies and areas and regions of the world that have been represented. So it's a manner of regularized writing, vision, and study that are dominated by imperatives and perspectives that have deep, I would say, racist ideological biases, deep stereotypical biases that are being applicable to the term Orient, even though initially when Said wrote Orientalism is in reference to the Muslim world or the Arab and Muslim world, but later on his understanding and his theory was applied to other places. So for example, we have a set of representation that are applicable to the Muslim subject. We have a set of representation applicable to Latin America and South America, a set of representation that applicable to Africa, a set of representation that is applicable to Asia. For example, you cannot have a story written on Africa without having to have something in there written about corruption or black on black violence, whether it's in Africa or in America. You can't write a piece on Latin America without having to drop the drug cartel right there in the middle. Otherwise, your piece is not, quote, fitting into the mode of representation. So Orientalism is, in essence, is a structure of representation that is used by scholars. So it's not only that you have it in public discourse, but it's actually scholarship that begins to be cited and reproduced by one generation of scholars and the others, and therefore it's not surprising to continue to see the multiple debacles that takes place, because at the root of it, it's a knowledge production that is erroneous in nature, that is a representation. And in essence, it's a constructing an image of the Orient that is completely negative representation, or the negative mirror image of us, meaning the Occident or the West. And then you get the question of why, or we should get them to be like us. So you get the whole project, whether it's development theory, economic theory, political theory, that takes Eurocentricity and its mode of production and mode of knowledge production to be the universal norm. So that's, I think, has to be part of the understanding of what the overall conceptualization of Said in Orientalism. In essence, he said, my experience with the Arab world, where he comes from, had no correspondence to the text, to the material, to what he read about in relations to the Arab world that tended to be around scholars in academic circles that are writing about the Arab and Muslim world. And he wanted to actually work through the process of deciphering what are these representations that are there. And I think his Covering Islam book is an added piece to Orientalism, because it comes at a very critical point. He wrote Covering Islam after the Iranian Revolution, and how the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian religious figures were represented, and therefore there was a distinctive anti-Shia discourse that emerged. So Islamophobia in its initial or most modern representation, it had a very distinctive anti-Shia crystallization of the image of Khomeini and the image of these protesters and these black figures that basically are completely depersonalized, having no political agency or understanding from the Orientalist representation. So Covering Islam becomes an important piece to understand. And I think in 1997 he put a new addition to it, and he said that the situation of representation of Islam is worse, considering even that we had more time to actually learn and understand. And this is also this contact theory, that people being in contact with Muslims or with the otherwise subject will end up undoing the racist paradigm, and the stereotypical paradigm is challenged by, again, the writing that he shows in relations to his updated 1997 version of Covering Islam. So that's, I think, to crystallize the Orientalism as a book that focuses on knowledge production at the core and critiques the modes of representation that are salient and continues to be reproduced to the present context.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you. A few points that the intro kind of touches on Orientalism. So we just read the intro. We didn't read the entire dense book. But I think a few concepts that when I was reading for the first time really struck me was this idea of dichotomies, like false dichotomies and binaries, as well as the idea of linear time. Would you mind breaking down what linear time is and why it's inherently flawed in Western?
Yeah. Well, let's take a look first in terms of the dichotomy or the binaries, because at the core of Orientalism is a structure of binary, is us and them, that we're actually two separate territories, two separate categories that are essentially on two separate sides, and there's no communication or conversation, or that the world is actually made of multiplicity. So the notion when we say Europe or the Occident and the West as distinctive from the Muslim world or the East, or if we think of China or Japan, this demarcation is a constructed demarcation. I think people who are observant, or at least have studied Europe, Europe did not come to be Europe as a continent until post the 1492 expulsion and the removal of Muslims and Jews, and then the crafting of Europe as a white Christian continent, even though that in the middle of Europe you had Muslim population that people were completely awakened to in 1992 when the Bosnian genocide takes place, and then Kosovo and so on. And so this demarcation of a binary and a dichotomy is a constructed binary, constructed dichotomy. If we go back to even to the what we call the Middle Ages, we find that this dichotomy had no existence whatsoever. The Mediterranean was a very vibrant area of engagement politically, economically, socially, culturally, religiously. It was a fluid area and a fluid territory that many participants engaged in it. So this concept that there is a constant historical line of time that is present in there, and this time, in essence, in relations to how often Islam is represented relative to conflict with the West or the Christian world, that is, in essence, if we look and examine it much more closely, it actually falls by the wayside, and the history is far more dynamic and far more complex. And I think in here he tries to point out to this dichotomy the whole notion of imagined geographies, how there's, when we speak about the Arab world, what are these imagined geographies? What happened in the Arab and Muslim world? These are constructed geographies that fit into the existing paradigm. So the thesis is written and the conclusion is written. All what you need is to fill in between these what you call factual nuggets from the researcher. And if you get, again, if the factual nugget has a hijab or a beard, a thick beard, and a very long dress, then basically you got your nugget. That's all what you need. No analysis whatsoever is needed in order to push forth this thesis. So I think Edward Said, in essence, in looking and introducing the concept of Orientalism this way, he really goes to the core of what is wrong with knowledge production in a Eurocentric paradigm relative to the Muslim world and the others. Another important concept, which I think is also important relative to it, is the notion of latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism. And I think in here, he's using, again, possibly Freud's work on dreams and the repressive, or the dreams and what happens in an individual's mind, and how those tend to be an aspect that influences and acts upon the individual. In the same way, latent Orientalism is essentially the unconscious, untouchable certainty about the Orient, or about the rest of the world, or the Southern Hemisphere. And this latent Orientalism, and you could say latent racism, is made by a very well-structured cultural paradigm. In essence, you could say that we are living in an Orientalist imaginary almost on a daily basis. The stories that we read, the literature that we engage in, the movies that we watch, the TV shows, the news pieces, the cartoons, the racist and funny that we constantly engage in, that becomes all the scope of latent Orientalism. And then we would see, or we will get into the manifest Orientalism, which is the policies that are built upon latent Orientalism. So I think often many of those who want to work on countering racism or countering Orientalism, they work on the manifest aspect of it, while that which is latent remains almost untouched. I would say people should be paying attention as much to the cartoons that are given to children at a young age, more so than possibly what Trump utters from his mouth on a daily basis. Because Trump is speaking, or at least his language is reflected into the dominant discourse for the adults. But the same type of otherization, the same type of latent Orientalism Orientalism and otherization is taking place at the cartoons in terms of how the black person is represented, how is the Arab person is represented, what type of voices they are given, what type of social environment that are there, that are constructed, are their faces being, or the space that they inhabit, is it darkened and fearful, or is it filled with light and ease? All those are part that we don't think about, but I think it's really where the domain of work to undo and to begin to challenge the Orientalist and racist paradigm that is there, which is a very more difficult work than just opposing a legislation. I'm not saying that people don't need to do that, but to understand that the legislation comes out from a whole fertile ground of Orientalist imaginary and conceptualization that is there, that gives the policy and gives the articulation what it is. So that's, I think, it's one of the aspects or one of the areas that Edward Said wanted to really examine. And I extend his notion of manifest Orientalism and latent Orientalism to manifest and latent Islamophobia. In the same way that we tend to focus only on the manifest Islamophobia without thinking about the latent Islamophobia in order for us to really undo the structure of thought that informs the thought that is out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. People are really enjoying what you're saying right now and agreeing. Someone also mentions that Reza Aslan has a nice video making a case that there should be a show similar to something like Modern Family that shows Muslims in the States, and like the value of representation and cartoons and things like this. But I think that also gets to another question in that you mentioned Islamophobia a lot, and talking about this larger system and structure in the United States that creates and perpetuates it. And I personally use the term anti-Muslim racism to describe a lot of this, because racism kind of precludes or assumes the idea that there are power structures that profit and contribute to this, rather than just, as you mentioned, it's not just what Trump is saying or just what one person is saying. We can't just solve everything by holding hands and doing interfaith work. So what has sort of changed, if anything, since Said has published this groundbreaking work for his time? Have things gotten better or worse? And how does it sort of play into a larger idea of what Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, if you have a preference of the term, today?
I think the debate about the term, we have published a number of pieces, and almost every conference that we have on Islamophobia begins with the debating of the term. Let me say that terms are socially constructed and intellectually constructed. It's how you make them operational in this sense. Even the term racism has actually many, many different definitions, and there's definitely no consensus on it. But the differences and debates on the term should not actually confuse us with the phenomena that it describes. So the fact that somebody says, I want to use anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, is not a debate about what is happening to the Muslim, them, her, or himself. Is actually just a debate on terminologies and how you make it operational. And for me, at this point, that debate is an academic one rather than a substantive one. What is important is that I think we are living in an Islamophobic or anti-Muslim racism social imaginary. And it's not limited to the Western world. I actually am writing a piece on Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries, where Muslim agency and Muslim subjectivity is actually being problematized, more so in the current period. So to say that I want to be a Muslim that have my own self-determination, that itself is a contested terrain, because there's only one universal norm at this point, which is to imitate and to reflect and to replicate the European European experience and European trajectory of how their society develops. So it's not a particular norm, but rather it's a universal norm. And therefore, I argue that history today is Eurocentric. Definition of a human is Eurocentric. Economics is Eurocentric. Social relations are Eurocentric. And as such, I would say that we have moved from Edward Said describing the phenomena to actually being the phenomena being global in nature and internalized by the subject matter themselves, whether Muslim or otherwise. Almost everyone wants to replicate or wants to have proximity to what they assume to be the superior and what they assume to be both racially superior, economically, politically, and militarily. And I think that's where we are in a much more pernicious period at this point, post Said's writing. More importantly, that many of the influencers on decision making at this particular time in the United States, in Europe, and I would argue in the Muslim world, have adopted an Orientalist worldview and a clash of civilization worldview. Even among Muslims, that argument tends to actually be repeated, and therefore consolidating this constructed mode of representation to the sense that you actually represent yourself in the eyes of the other. And I argue that today Muslims are essentially supporting actors in their own play. You're actually in your own life, you're a supporting actor, you're not actually living your own story. And if you're invited on the theater, you're invited to deliver the tea to the main actors and to step out, exit stage left, without uttering a word, even though that the story and the play is about you. And I think that's the phenomena that we have arrived at, which is in the inability to see the self and to see the self as having an impact and being able to reflect and determine its own present as well as its own future. And I think that's the circumstance. I think W.D. Du Bois, in terms of the souls of black folks, I think that's where we are at this point in relations to how we see ourselves with the eyes of someone else gazing at us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one question, thank you for that. That was very well put. A lot of people are really looking forward to your paper. So the first question is, where can people find that when it's published? And the second is, what would be an example of non-Eurocentric social relations?
Well, my paper is going to be a chapter in a book that will be edited by Farid Hafiz, and literally I'm just in the middle of writing it. And once it's written, it will be put on my website as well. Again, in terms of non-Western relations, take a look at, for example, our economic patterns or our economic activity. A deep level of different economic activity is, again, the notion that the sustainer of the world is God. And therefore, we have embraced the economic of scarcity. Adam Smith, that we are living in a world of scarcity, which is completely opposite our deep epistemological understanding in relations to Islam, that Allah is Ar-Razzaq, and your sustenance can multiply many times over, and therefore it's not contingent on having to fight the other as a way to try to achieve or acquire your rizq. One clear example is to go to traditional markets in the Muslim world. You will find all those people who sell spices are in the same market. And they're not competing with one another. Actually, they're sitting and they're all trying to do their best. And sometimes if they don't have the material, they'll say, I'll go to my neighbor, and they actually get from their neighbor to sell.
So true.
But this is an understanding that the customer that is coming to them is not coming to them because of their skill, talent, smartness, connivance in the market, that the rizq is coming to them from God. And all what they do is to do their best as a service to God, because they have to answer for it in the hereafter. So again, I had made an argument in one of the papers that Islamic contracts are to be finalized in the hereafter, not the fact that you are being paid. So again, many of these contracts, as we know, lawyers these days, you could actually write a contract where you actually dispossess the other person and saying that you are engaging in a contractual agreement. So in this sense, in the market, you see it's a cooperative market, which is the Quranic text, tijaratun an taradin, that it's a trade based on contentment of parties in the market. In today's economic behavior, it's like you want to have exclusivity in, if you're in a mall or in a market strip, that you want to actually have, you have to be the only shoe seller or coffee seller in the market because you don't want to have competition. So again, this is a very simple economic activity based on an epistemological, cultural aspect that is related to Islamic understanding that have a profound reflection upon people's social patterns in the market. So we're not trying to, what you call, to bankrupt each other. So for me to win, you have to lose. That is a specific development that occurs at a particular period of time. And what we see is that most Muslim countries, if not the rest of the world, everybody is trying to be like what they assume to be the global norm, which is to embrace a pernicious type of globalization, pernicious type of capitalism, and they think that they're actually going to move ahead. All what they're doing is actually they're undermining their own existing social patterns, social structure, and epistemological structures. So that's, I think, just on an easy way to understand on the fine point of how the market is organized traditionally, and it created what we call today, if you go to many of these companies, they have the buzzword synergy, right? Traditional markets were constructed around synergy between the various participants. Actually, everybody who wants to buy, whether it's spice or leather, can go to a place that actually create a synergetic market around those products.
Oh, so sorry, you're breaking up just a bit.
Yeah. I would say that I was speaking about that the concept of synergy, that today is a buzzword among these corporate elites to say that what we need is to create synergy. So we're going to try to buy another company, so we'll create a synergy between our product and this other product. Well, again, if you look at traditional markets, they were constructed around synergies within a particular space, whether it's a spice market or leather market, that there was a synergy in there created by a deep epistemological structure that people had.
Mm-hmm. So your screen is a little bit frozen, and your voice is breaking up just a little bit for these last few lines.
Okay.
Do you think it'd help if we hung up and recalled really quickly?
It's up to you. If you want to do that and people can join, that's fine.
Okay, I'll call you again.
Okay.
1 second. Okay, they'll have to stare at my face in the meantime. Sorry.
Are you still recording, or you have to make a switch? Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Wonderful. Okay. Good. Yeah, thank you for that. That was a very good example, and I think people were really engaging with it and also bringing up examples in their home countries as well. I think on that point as well is, people are now asking to repeat the marketplace analogy, if you would be able to.
Yeah, again, the which part?
Well, so we're going to be recording this, and so he has a clean recording that he's recording on his side, and so when we upload the podcast, we'll hear that part again. So I hope that's okay. I think it'd be better if we moved on to another question. So that being said, you're mentioning a lot of forms of latent Islamophobia. So a lot of things that we may not characterize as racism or Islamophobic, and yet because we've normalized it to a certain extent, or we've really internalized a lot of the things that Edward Said are mentioning. And so my question is the secularization of a lot of our spaces a type of internalized Islamophobia? We see, as a community organizer, I see a lot of organizing spaces even Muslim spaces, so Muslim social spaces that don't even, they go straight through prayer times. They are not, thinking about people fasting. And I feel like more and more our spaces are becoming more secularized. Is this a form of internalized Islamophobia? And are there other forms of internalized Islamophobia or latent Islamophobia that we may not be aware of that are incredibly problematic?
Well, again, I think in terms of what the Muslim, I'm getting the feedback from your side. Is that that's better right now, because I was getting the feedback coming this way. I think it's important when we think about what is being placed at the Muslims, both locally and globally. There is an effort to quote reform Islam, and I think
so sorry to cut you off.
there's a notion of the need to reform Islam.
Sorry, your
audio
is still picking up. Would you mind turning off your camera? That might be helpful.
Okay, let's see.
Sorry.
Is this better?
Yay. Yes, much better. Okay. I hope.
Okay, so there is this effort or this push that Islam needs to be reformed. And this has been a call originating almost for 200 plus years, if not longer. If one goes back again to Edward Said's writing, he wrote or dated the writing or the entry of Orientalism to the arrival of Napoleon with his army and scientists to Egypt in 1797. And during his campaign, this was both a military campaign but also a scientific expedition to record Egypt as it never been recorded before, but it was not recorded for the Egyptians to look or to see, but it's actually for the onset of the colonial project. What is significant is that when Napoleon met resistance in the south of Cairo, he actually began to engage in what we call today a public relations campaign, calling for a meeting with the scholars of Al-Azhar, and in order for them to, in essence, to neutralize what he felt, the resistance that was coming at the point from both the religious figures as well as the communities that were responding to them. And in essence, he put himself as wanting to reform and to help them to get the yoke of, at the time, the Ottomans and to liberate the Egyptians. And that same dichotomy, or that same what you call framing, is the same that comes after 9/11 period and this whole notion of reforming Islam. And you get the writing of some like the Rand Corporation, Charles Bernard, the Civil Democratic Islam, and all types of articulation of what is needed to try to bring the Muslim subject into the modern civilized world. So in this sense, that project has resulted in internalized aspect of the Muslims, that the problem is Islam, that becomes part of the wide discourse, and therefore it begins to actually take steps to try to prove or to illustrate that Islam is not the problem. And by even saying that is an internalization of the thesis that Islam is the problem. Because it begins to what I call undertaking what's called performative Islam, that you're performing Islam to fit the needs of someone else, or to fit the requirements of the external gazing that is calling for you, or calling you or labeling you as being a subhuman, uncivilized, that is pre-modern, traditional, and so on. And what is needed is a requirement to take yourself out of this into the modern, progressive, enlightened, so on. But the question is, what are the measuring sticks? What are the who determines whether you arrived or not? And what we find is, in a sense, is attempting to replicate the historical trajectory of Europe in relations to the Reformation, and to try to create the modern nation state in whatever disparate notions is to embrace a centralized state, embrace a very particular type of capitalism, and of a particular type of social patterns that are focused on the individual and de-aggregate the group dynamics or the group responsibility and so on. So in this sense, Muslims begin to internalize that specific type of trajectory. So all of us are Muslims in bodies. Our bodies are Muslims, but our actions are Eurocentric, and attempting to replicate Eurocentricity in our behavior, our conduct at the local level, at politics, at economics, at social patterns. Even our religious discourse becomes also confined to that notion. So when we say that Islam is a way of life, then what does that mean if we actually are beginning to say that Islam is only in the private space? I already said that in an economic contract, the contract is to be looked upon as not only from the physical temporal world, but actually has implication in the metaphysical world. So what does that mean if we're only thinking or confining ourselves on those notions? So I think that's what I'm referring to, of the internalized Orientalism and internalized Islamophobia that begins to act and impinge on the individual's ability to think and determine and see themselves in the world in a way that is conducive to who they are in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And I think on that point a little bit, so this kind of gets into a little bit out of the academic space and more into like the political and community organizing space. So a lot of the times, I think today, it could be a form of internalized Islamophobia or maybe other reservations, but also there is a certain sort of, a lot of the times when I think Muslim communities are sort of citing respectability politics that bring people out of organizing or call people out for organizing, they try to cite maybe verses from the Quran, and also people can also kind of see Edward Said's own work as almost putting, in a way, too much hope in his humanistic principles and values. So as opposed to, for example, Asada Shakur, whose writing that we read, and she says, to quote, "Nobody in the world, nobody in the history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of their oppressors." Do you think Said would agree with this? Do you agree with this? What do you kind of see with respectability politics in terms of academia and organizing?
Well, I tend to look at it again from a variety of lenses. Edward Said's writing was specifically to undo and to critique the intellectual writings and the scholarly writing about the time, about the Arab and Muslim world. And therefore, he was critiquing the structure of knowledge and the production of knowledge in that way. Asada Shakur was coming from, again, the 1960s, the challenge of the power structure, the racism, the Jim Crow, and so on. So rather than, again, creating a binary between both, I would say that what we need to look is at what are the nuances that each has given to the challenge, because I don't think that it's a one aspect that is to over-dominate the others, in the sense that if you look at the civil rights movement, had many components to it. There was an intellectual component, there was a protest component, there was a legal component in terms of the challenges in court by Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP. There was a legislative component, and there was a religious component relative to the churches, and also there was a dialogue component or challenging other faiths, in particular relative to aspect of the Christian churches that were staying away. So in essence, it was a far more dynamic engagement in this sense and had many different pieces. What the Muslims today, in essence, in the world is that we have not developed, or at least we have not articulated, what is our mode of organizing, one, what is our mode of empowerment, and how to replicate or develop a spiritually based decolonial project. And I think for me that's been one of the areas that I've been trying to think about, of how to be able to decolonize with a commitment, a spiritual commitment, a spiritual center to engage from, meaning in terms of a center of thought for a decolonial project. And that have to be a multi-dimensional and dynamic process. We do have to decolonize our history. We need to decolonize our sense of ourselves. And we need to decolonize our economy, politics, as well as our religious discourse that has been essentially disempowering. So I'm very critical of the respectability politics, where in essence, often you're invited to a dinner and you're on the menu and you're being respectable that you're being devoured. That is not an empowerment. That is basically accepting your inferiority and entering into the space in an inferior trajectory. So once you accept that as a form of engagement, then you're accepting your permanent structure of disempowerment. As you know, we say in the English language, there is no such thing as free lunch. So when somebody is inviting you for free lunch, the first question should be asked of why am I being invited to this free lunch, and what is the other person at least attempting to get from me by this free lunch. So you're actually paying for the lunch, but you're just not realizing that the price is you. And I think what we need is to develop the ethics of asking and posing those questions, especially Muslims living as minorities in the United States and Europe. They tended to, respectability politics has become the norm rather than the exception. And I think what we need is to challenge those paradigm.
Mm-hmm. And does this also, how does this sort of also factor in the everyday individual that we see? So for example, like, you know, Zionism as a structure and system is obviously awful and terrible, and we should resist at all costs. But do you feel that we have a responsibility to treat an individual person on an individual level with a certain level of, you know, for example, inviting them to these conversations? So because we've read also, we explicitly do not work with white supremacist or Zionist organizations. Is this sort of an exclusionary space then in your opinion?
Well, again, there's different conversations for different setting. Mm-hmm. Engaging, let's say, your opponents has a different setting than engaging in your own internal discussions and in community. Those spaces have to be distinct and have to be respected as such. So again, this whole notion that everybody has to be in the same conversation at all times is something that is, from a conceptual basis, has to be set aside as one does not serve the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, and that even if you want to challenge Zionism, white supremacy, and so on, that there is different modes and different ways that those challenges have to take place. I think what people are, again, have accepted this neoliberal notions that we're all just hold a hand and basically sing all the world. Yes, you're singing, but somebody is running all the way to the bank and taking your land, dispossessing you, and locking you up in prison, and you're singing we are the world. Yes, we are the world, but the world is in a shambles because we have not begun to actually articulate our moral, ethical outlook to the world. And I think that's what we need to constantly. I have no problem of talking to anyone, but it has to be at the right place, the right time, and also the terms of the discussions have to be defined. Whoever determines the terms of the discussion, in essence, controls the discussions all along. So we often are invited to discuss somebody else's ideas and make them our own. And I think that has to be for us to have self-respectability before we actually engage in the politics of respectability as a way to try to define who we are.
That was a brilliant last line. Thank you for that. I have two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up. There's been a lot of really good questions coming up. Just in a time check, Instagram Live might be ending in the next 10 minutes, but we'll jump back on. Again, we're with Dr. Hatem Bazian. He's on Twitter at HatemBazian, and you can find all of his brilliant work and writing at his website at hatembazian.com. Thank you so much for all of these brilliant questions, but also answers. Another question that I have that kind of comes on the same line is that you mentioned that you see our lack of respectability and our sort of large internalization of Islamophobia and secularization of our spaces. Something that really stuck out for me for Edward Said's writing and covering Islam is that he almost sees Islam as the perpetual enemy in the eyes of the West due to their histories of resistance. So one of the few sort of identities that have continuously resisted U.S. occupation, imperialism, capitalism. Do you think that this is changing today with brands like the Nike Pro Hijab? Now, a lot of us are sort of running with our money to exploitative brands that exploit Muslim women. Muslims are joining the military and posting videos on Instagram. This generations of essentially internalized Islamophobia. Do you feel that right now Islam is the same as it was, or do you think Edward Said would be seeing the same thing, or you yourself?
Well, I think Edward Said, maybe I'll take an issue in here in relations to saying that Islam has been resisting the West and so on. I actually tend to argue the other way. In terms of, we look at the 20th century in particular, and post Second World War. From 1945 to 1979, Muslim groups, even those that we might think to be committed to a critique of the West, actually joined in the Cold War and were part of what called the Western Alliance against the defeat of the Soviet Union. And in this sense, they took on challenging what they, at the time, socialism. They opposed the socialist regimes or socialist states in the Arab and Muslim world, and aligned themselves with the West, making the argument using, again, Quranic as well as other notions that since the communists don't believe in God and the West believes in God, so we're more closer to those who believe in God in this alliance. So they actually aligned themselves with the Western Alliance and articulated Islam as being pro-capitalist, pro-globalization. So basically, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ becomes a figure that actually corresponds to the notions that you have in to articulate Western epistemology in this sense. And then you could see that the writings in the 60s and 70s by many of the Muslim groups were essentially preoccupied by critiquing and taking on communism. This continues to post 79. So 79, you had two major events. You had the invasion of Russian invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution, which was again labeled or defined as a Shia Islamic revolution. And the Sunni world was mobilized to confront or to be party and participant in confronting Iran, and that's where we get the Iran-Iraq war, and then also recruited to do the jihad or the mujahideen in Afghanistan to bloody the Russian face. So again, I think when we look at the history and nuance the history and take a look at much deeper, it becomes a far more complicated than just a simple saying demarcation. Now, at a deeper level, one can argue that because there's a deep ethical moral outlook relative to the Muslim, him or herself, that at the individual level and maybe at a certain collectivity, there is a rejection of oppression. But that has to be articulated in a systematic way. And unfortunately, the 20th century have seen our politics, whether at the local or the global level, becoming a junior partner in the whole enterprise of trying to be part of the global world order as a junior partner, and taking on and being in pernicious relationships that are, I would say, contrary to the basic ethical moral outlook of Islam and what I read relative to the Islamic text historically and in the contemporary period. So I think this notion that Islam has always been, I think it has to be nuanced and looked upon in the 20th century. I think the history is a little bit far more problematic in this side.
Mm. One related question to that just came up is, where is the non-aligned movement today?
Well, it seems that it's in a shopping center purchasing Nike with a hijab on it. There's nothing left of the non-aligned movement. Once again, the non-aligned movement was decimated in the 1970 and was put to the pastures at the end of, I would say, the Cold War. So at this point, actually, we don't have a non-aligned movement. There's only one shoe fit all. We're in a unipolar world dominated by the United States, and everybody is trying to be a junior partner and to be invited to the prom, even though that there are many suitors for the prom that is in there, and you could see it in the activities of many of these Arab and Muslim countries that are just rushing to the gate just to pay the fee in order for them to be invited to be devoured at the dinner table.
Wonderful, thank you. On that note, I'm going to, because this is about to cut off, and I think the next question is something that people have also been asking a lot about, where do we go from now? I'm going to go ahead and end this Instagram live session so we can save it, and then I'm going to restart another one right in a second.
Sure.
So save your questions for that session since these won't be saved. Great, okay. We'll be right back. And live video, share. Also, I think you can bring your camera back. The quality is infinitely better now. If you'd like to.
Yep.
Dr. Bazian. Awesome. Loading. Are you good on time?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, great. We'll just have one more question and then we'll open it up. People are really enjoying your comments, to say the least. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining. Sorry about this Instagram time limit. We're gonna work something out. But we're still here with Dr. Hatem Bazian, and we're just have one more question that I want to ask about where we go next, and then I'll open it up for discussion. I know some people wanted to jump on and join the line conversation, so we can also Feel free to join and ask your questions, your comments. If you agree, disagree, let us know. You can also tweet at Hatem Bazian, HATEM BAZIAN, and we're Instagram or live tweeting this conversation, and we're at Because We've Read if you'd like to follow us there. Everyone's giving their woohoos and hearts right now, so I think it's a good time to pass it on over. I'm going to switch the screen. Your camera seems to be loading, but that's okay. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, wonderful. So the last question that I have that a lot of people were also asking is where do we go from this? So you mentioned that we're sort of in a crisis right now. And what do you think that we need to be doing right now as individuals, collectively around the world, to be able to not only challenge sort of the latent Islamophobia or Orientalism, as you mentioned, but also work on creating those structures that really vocally talk about our values and our collective wants and needs. So what are our next steps? What do we do?
Well, I think first, foremost is to take ourselves seriously. And I always say that the person you're waiting for to help you is here. It's you. We have had deep down within our Islamic or Muslim psyche is that we're waiting for some hero to come. So we'll say, some people say, oh, if Salah ad-Din was here, or if Abu Bakr was here, or if Ali was here, he would fix things. And I say no, if he's here, he would most likely be arrested, and looks around, there's nobody behind him. So again, I think one is to take yourself seriously and to say that I am the person that needs to make history and to shape my history and shape my future. Second, which is also very critical, is that we have to have a set of principles that we operate by. If you don't have a set of principles, people will give you theirs. And they always are able to load to you their own what you call psychological deficiencies, and also deficiencies in policies and so on. And then you actually are embarking on a project that is not your own. So determining the critical issues that you need to work on by setting a set of principles. And again, I've been working on developing a set of principles for Muslims, notion of liberation theology, as well as the Muslim principles of engagement. And these are, again, coming from deep from our own tradition. Paramount is the concept of justice, al-adl, to make sure that we are a people that are deeply, deeply rooted in an epistemology of justice. But also it's wedded to mercy, because again, this is a relationship between justice and mercy. And mercy is also misunderstood, because often people think that mercy is to be in a state of weakness. It's actually to express mercy is a state of strength. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in 113 chapters of the Quran describes himself by each of the beginning of the chapter, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is the defining character of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, غَلَبَتْ رَحْمَتِي غَضَبِي, that my mercy have taken over my wrath. The misunderstanding is that mercy is the person who has the power to extract revenge, but they opt to be merciful at that moment, which means that it's a moment when you have maximum power or maximum strength and the ability to undertake this revenge, that you opt to be merciful. Often today people confuse our state of weakness, or what we call Uncle Tomness, with that I want to be merciful. And I think that has to be nuanced of how to balance a call for justice with mercy, so we are reflecting divine characteristics as we engage, because we are a spiritual community that is based on a spiritual understanding and also a metaphysical understanding. equality of all human beings is paramount. And I think we need to challenge not only racism in the global north, but also racism and tribalism and all types of differentiations that occurs among us in terms of the Muslim world. And we know that some of those inequalities that exist have taken deep sense to it. And also I say that the racial hierarchy or the racial matrix is operable in the Muslim world just as it is operable in the global north. And that's why one of the most widely used cream in the Muslim world is Fair and Lovely, which is again is that cream that bleaches people's faces in order to make them look and appear to be white. And then you have the tribal inequalities that exist, gender inequalities, right? So what we need is to challenge this from our own understanding that again, Islam demolished the racial paradigm. Says all of you are from Adam, and Adam is from the dust of the earth. So if you want to boast about the dust of the earth, nothing to boast about. So again, that is in there. To speak about economic justice and economic equity. And I think if we look at how our outlook in economics, we have to manifest this. And I would say that what we need is to create successful economic models at the local level. I've been a proponent of rethinking and re-examining how zakat is to be used as a stimuli for the economy. Also to rethink awqaf and how awqaf can be a model of sustainable economic development. So all those notions of how to use some of our existing tradition, our existing sources to come up with unique and innovative solutions to the current problem. You don't need to go to the global north to try to tell you how to solve your own problem, which again, the crisis globally is again that we're reproducing failure, and we think just because somebody comes up with a degree that is written on at Harvard or London School of Economics that all of a sudden they're going to actually fix our economy. It's structured to prevent you from developing. So many of these development theories are structured to maintain you in a state of structured underdevelopment. So we need to be very cognizant of how to create local modalities and to use our historical references and modes of historical development in order to retool and re-innovate in the economic aspect, because we need to address people's economic needs. So there are many areas that people need to actually work, and I see that the world is full of opportunities for us to reflect our deep sense of spiritual values and epistemology in putting programs that will transform humanities.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, the system is not broken. It's actually doing exactly what it is intended to do.
Absolutely.
Yes. One question also related that just came up by _IZA. How do you think oppressed people should go about unifying across cultural divides? I believe that there is strength in banding together. Also, this, because we've read, is also very international. So how did people sort of start making those relationships and building together internationally across borders?
Well, I think one, we have to have a basic commitment that my empowerment is contingent on empowering others with me, because it's a collectivity. And what we need is to see of how to deprogram those barriers that have been constructed in our own mind, whether through a distorted educational system that attempted to try to verify the modern nation state and to verify a particular type of notion of nationalism that antagonized domestically between the various different groupings within the society and then across borders. So you'll find, let's say, somebody, let's say, from Jordan and Palestine will not actually see each other as being equal and codependent on each other in how to develop an alternative and mode of engagement. And you think of the tension or the stoking of tension between Iraq and Iran that had been part of the colonial legacy and crafting these borders that wanted to intensify Shia, Sunni, Kurdish aspects of nationalism, and then use Shia Sunni dynamics as a way of crafting a maintenance and extension of colonization. So there has to be a deprogramming of those things that we hold in our mind to be true, and they are only a figment of the colonial imagination that has been internalized, and we're acting upon them on a regular basis. So it's a heavy lifting, it's a deliberate work, systematic work, and what we need is to develop these skills of how to actually be unified with difference. That is the challenge. Often we think that the only way for us to be unified if we agree 100%. You don't agree with your own self 100%. It's like, get up in the morning, you have an idea, and in the afternoon you have a different idea. And I tend to say, if I agree with myself 50% of the time every day, I'm in a good shape. So how do you demand in a very different political context, social context, economic context, racial context, as well as colonial, post-colonial period, how do you work in order to craft those relationships in such a way that it's the empowerment of all that is contingent on accepting the diversity and people coming with different articulations but agreeing on the core principles for moving forward. And I think that is the biggest and most difficult task that is upon us, is to do so. I would say that in some of the work that we have done in Europe with both on Islamophobia as well as in decolonial framework has been, I don't want to say very successful, but successful in trying to bring different people from different point of view in conversation and in coalition. We've also been trying to forge what's called a South-South dialogue. Most of the dialogues that have been taking place is that people from the South, from different places, are invited in the global North in order to have a conversation in New York, in London, in Paris, in different places, but there is no dialogue South-South between people that are looking both at what was done in the past as well as articulating it forward in order to see what could be done moving forward in a cooperative and in a cross-reference in our history. For example, many Muslim countries or many Muslim activists don't take and examine the Latin American experience, both in terms of resisting the U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Policy during the Monroe Doctrine, their intervention in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Panama, in other places. They don't look at that modality and they try to exceptionalize Muslim experience. And in this sense, I think they fail because they look at Muslimness as the way to evaluate and look at the circumstances rather than looking at the particular policies, particular approaches, and in order to have a comparative approach to understand what type of policies that have been implemented and how to actually shape a coalition and forge a coalition in order to challenge this. I think that's where, for me, is the heavy lifting that needs to take place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sounds really beautiful. Another also example that I just want to chime in really quickly is I think there are a lot of, unfortunately, but also fortunately, a lot of the systems and structures that oppress against Muslims, Black people, Indigenous people are really the same. And so being able to find those particular pressure points, such as the military police complex or prisons, detention centers. So all of these are really focus points that maybe were created to incarcerate one group of people but have expanded to many, or the relationship between the military and the police. There are so many places that the state collaborate in sort of oppressing different communities of people. So it's also what I like to do, at least, is a strategy of coming together with different community groups that are oppressed by the same institution and then coming together to challenge those together in a sort of
Absolutely.
larger.
Yeah. And also look at their success. What was their success? What were their moments of really having victory and countering those elements? I think is very important.
Definitely. Yes. Somebody also asked on that point, Khadija, she asks, how can we challenge the political economy from a radical perspective while contributing toward that systemic tension? So not actively contributing toward the system that is the source of the problem.
Well, I think that's where working on trying to craft a local response in areas where you are able to craft those. Again, the dilemma that we find ourselves that we're inside this pernicious economic box, and how to craft areas where we begin to open possibly a window, and then maybe to open larger window and to create a possible alternative that ends up into getting us outside of the box. And that's where the difficulty is. So I don't want to sugarcoat it and say, oh, it's easy. That's very difficult. And I think it has to begin at the local level to look at what areas of competitive advantage that you might have to try to create an alternative modality, economic modality, and to create this economic relations at the local level where individuals from different possibilities can come together in order to do that. So I think it's a difficult task, but it has to start at the local level with the unique circumstances of each group and taking their competitive advantage in that area for them to move forward economically. Again, I think from the Muslim perspective, I think the zakat category as well as awqaf should be re-examined, because these were two major institutions that have had a tremendous impact. And then again, for the Shia community, the khums has also played a role in those economic activities. And I think what we need to examine, what was successful even up to the later part of 19th, early 20th century. Awqafs were in the surplus, and the emergence of modern nation state took hold of the awqaf as a source of revenue for the state, and therefore disrupted their normative pattern of localized economic sustainable development that also empowered those individuals that were running or overseeing these awqaf. So I think those are areas that I would encourage for people to examine and begin to construct sustainable economic models. Also experimenting of workers' ownership of enterprises, I think is very important, which ties into the awqaf, because awqaf today, people, when you say awqaf, they think it's just building a mosque and just going home, because that's going to be what the reward for you in the hereafter. Most of our markets in the traditional cities were actually set up as awqaf. And it created a particular type of relationship training program for individuals to come through these guilds and begin to have some way of engagement in the market. It's not surprising that the last prophet, from our perspective, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, was a merchant. It's not surprising that the first Khalifa, even though setting aside differences of opinion, the first Khalifa Abu Bakr is a merchant. The second Khalifa is a merchant. The third Khalifa is a merchant. It's not surprising that actually you only get to Ali radiallahu anhu, who is the judge in terms of training. So it's not surprising that the first Khalifa, the last prophet, his wife Khadija is a merchant. It's not surprising in relations. And then Mecca itself was a crossroad for caravans. It did not have agriculture. And I think there are some lessons for us to understand, because again, the merchants have maximum contact of people on a daily basis. If you just have a small store, you have 200 to 300, maybe 500 people that are in contact with you. So what was those salient economic principles that made Islam a civilization that was rooted in economics? Because if you think about it, it was really structured around economics on the one hand, and the second on the text, which is the book, meaning Quranic text and so on, that created the principles or the umbrella by which this trade occurred. And I think we could be very innovative at this point in time to try to address the problems that interest rates and manipulating interest rate up and down, and having central banks basically printing fictitious money and thinking that is wealth. I think we could challenge and bring different notions of what real growth and what is real economic activity looks like, that actually centers the human as the most important element of the economy, rather than the bottom line that is unseen and basically is fictitious in value.
Thank you. Somebody asked to join the live conversation. Ma'ab, I think. Let me see if they're still there. Oh, yes. Okay. Can you... Oh, no. Hold on. Switch the camera. Oh, no, they're gone. They were here for a second. All right. Well, Ma'ab, if you'd like to ask your question, you can definitely do so still either joining live or commenting below. It's 11:20, so we'll just take one or two final questions. Let's see. Okay. Rob asks, where did it go? She says, you both mentioned something earlier about how the system is actually working on how it should. Can you please elaborate on that and whether or not the system is intended to inflict injustice and why?
I would say I would encourage people to read the Commission on the South by Susan George. It's Naomi Wolf as well. If you think about it, the economic structure is actually also I recommend Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's another book that people should read. It's a quick read. It's structured to around debt and extension of loans and debt to the global South, while working with post-colonial elites that have been trained in the global North and sent back to try to manage the post-colonial state. And therefore, indebtedness becomes a way to shift resources from the global South to the global North. Also, the WTO, the World Trade Organizations, and before it GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, set up the mechanism and the rules of trade that is situated on maintaining and incentivizing raw material export from the global South to the global North. So because the global North is the site of the manufacturing, industrial output, and so on, to be sent back as finished product. Even though that today we are seeing some fracture in this, in terms of that some of the manufacturing is being shifted from the global North to the global South, or parts of the global South, whether it's China, Indonesia, Singapore, and other places, because of the cost of labor. And the global North is moving toward far more heavy industrialization in very lucrative sector, and then information technology, where the many of these companies are monetizing this information technology and intellectual property rights and so on. But it's all previewed on a particular economic policy that is maintaining the global South in a state of dependence. And whatever foreign aid that is given is actually, it's an indirect subsidy to global North companies in order to come and set shop and supposedly, quote, help the global South, but they end up actually doing their work specifically to disrupt local economic patterns, local economic activities, and if anything that is given at the local level, it's only downstream economic development or assembly line and nothing more. So I think, again, anyone that looks at the economic policy will agree that this is situated at maintaining the disparity. And we know that during the period of the heavy indebtedness of the global South, there was a policy of what's called debt for equity swap that even took whatever equity they had in their natural resources in place or in replacement for their debt that they have acquired. And then the other push is this push that we have seen toward what's called privatization and globalization. And I think one of the areas that's understudied in relation to what we refer to as the Arab Spring is the impact of privatization in Egypt, impact of privatization in some of the other Arab countries. That was a massive wealth redistribution with a state policy that essentially took some of the major assets of the state and privatized them and globalized them to international companies that essentially gave bribes or paid bribes to some of the existing elites in these countries that were on the game and sold the collective wealth of global South countries, including some of the Arab countries. And I think Egypt is a case in point of this privatization, globalization that basically exposed the population and the Egyptian economy to another layer of pernicious capitalist intervention on back of a long history of colonial legacy from the late 19th century to the 20th century. So you have a whole modality in there that the global South is essentially the domain or the preview of maintaining underdevelopment and a source of continued outflow of capital to the global north. The last time I checked, there was a net outflow of capital of close to 150 to 160 billions a year coming from the global south to the global north, meaning that the poorest part of the world is subsidizing the richest part of the world. And any type of economic plans and development that does not address this fundamental shift and fundamental flow is a failure before you even begin. And I think that's should be part and parcel of how we think and examine models of development that are produced, in essence, to maintain that process. On the other hand, also one has to be also critique of what I call is the non-profit humanitarian industrial complex. On the one hand, you have what you call the pernicious privatization, globalization, hard edge, and then on the back end, you send these non-profit humanitarian industrial complex people, and I call them to be the emergency unit, like the ambulance that comes in to try to get the injured, as a way to say that we see we're trying to help and fix what is structurally it has been structured to can maintain the damage that is occurring in the global south. I recommend for people, I have a 5-part series on immigration and the collapse of the post-colonial, and in 2 of those, it's a 5-article series on my site that goes through this process, and I really problematize the notion of immigration to say this is a 200-year phenomena, rather than only thinking today of the Syrian immigrants or the African immigrants that are crossing the Mediterranean, is to actually complicate it a little bit more and to show that it's part of the post-colonial structure and that makes this possible rather than being incidental to it.
Thank you. And all of that is on his website at hatembazian.com, and we'll be sure to link that, as well as make sure that we have all of the books that he named. And when we're uploading this as a podcast next month, so no worries if you missed any of the book names or will forget the website. We have all of that, and we'll be uploading that as well. One final question that I've seen in the comments is, from the perspective of an African American, I've learned that even people that may seem like leaders have been very harmful to the cause. Do you worry about corrupt people who claim to speak for us? And I think this also...
Well, absolutely. I think that that's the sad part of the post-colonial period, is that many of the anti-colonial forces, anti-colonial personalities, there are some that were assassinated, killed, and so on, but many of them just shifted and began to be themselves part of the structure of corruption that, in essence, have made the problem even worse. But one has to understand that it's not only a matter of having a leader coming in. What we need to think is, are we transforming and changing the epistemology and the thinking process and the worldview in order for us to have a leader that reflects and is accountable to people, rather than being accountable to the World Bank, IMF, or any other type of sector. Most of the global south in the post-colonial period became accountable to the same ex-colonial motherlands that were in control of the colonies, and as such it's just a matter of taking the colonial troops out, but maintaining the colonial structure intact. So the educational structure worldview in the global south is still highly colonized. The economy is still part of the colonial economy that was placed in there, social patterns and so on. So again, there's a distinction between post-colonial and decolonization, and I think we have not entered decolonization. We are only in the post-colonial, and I think one has to understand that the leaders that were there were essentially are the managers of the post-colonial economy, and that shift has to take place and take leaders into accountability, so they would not become part of an oppressive structure and replicating the colonial structure that is there, which is for the most part that's been the case in the post-colonial period.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So someone asks, somebody else just answered. There's actually chanting that was happening in the group that said "down with global capitalism." So wasn't exactly. I was a bit surprised that this is where the conversation turned. But
well, again, I've been critical with what's called Islamic economics because it's been having Bismillah and then capitalism and Adam Smith in the middle and then Alhamdulillah at the bottom of the document. So essentially, it's replicating and it is not offering anything new. Therefore, I think part of it is what is distinctive when we say that we want a different economic modality.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And speaking of leaders, just thank you for being an amazing and inspiring leader for the Muslim community and beyond. There seems to be no other questions as of now. People are really engaged. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatem Bazian, for this conversations. The very last question that I have that I always ask is, what recommended readings do you have for everybody if they enjoyed Edward Said, and how can we support your work?
Well, I think they should read. They should read W.D. Du Bois, the Souls of Black Folks. I think it's a very important reading. I did mention for them to read Confessions of Economic Hitman. It's a very short reading, but it just gives you a sobering understanding of the economic undertaking. Also, Susan George's work on the Commission of the South that looking at the economic disparities between the global South and the global North. Those are important readings that need to be read. And then again, definitely encourage you to look at my writing and also possibly the writing of Salman Sayyid from the UK. He's at Leeds University. His work is very good, both in terms of Islamophobia and other elements as well. Ramon Grasfugel has a number of good pieces in relative to Islamophobia, but also problematizing knowledge production. So these are really very important works that people need to engage.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody who tuned in and listened. We live tweeted all of this. So if you missed the conversation, this will be saved on Instagram Live for 24 hours. We're also live tweeting. So highlights, any thoughts, please share. Any reflections that you have from this, so we can also uplift that. And we'll be saving this. We recorded the audio, and we'll be uploading next month as part of the Because We've Read podcast. So anyone who missed it can be sure to check all of that information out. Again, thank you so much. And this concludes the fourth Because We've Read Instagram live session. And just a reminder that next month we do have a break month, which means that we won't be reading any new text, but we encourage you to be working with your local Because We've Read chapters to do community organizing that relates to the themes of this readings, as well as we'll be having a Because We've Write. So we encourage people to be writing and submission in their reflections and thoughts from this unit of decolonization of Asada, Omar Barghouti, and Frantz Fanon, and now Edward Said. So we'll be giving you more information about that in the next week or so. So in the meantime, thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Bazian.
Thank you. And assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Bye.